All right, for today's video, I'm going to take a quick moment to talk about analogies and metaphors. This week I've read a couple articles, one on USA basketball, another in the chapter of a book that I'm reviewing, that advocated using analogies and metaphors in coaching instead of using more explicit instructions or in addition to more explicit instructions. The problem that I have isn't the use of metaphors and analogies, because I've advocated the same thing. The problem that I have is that the examples that are given in these articles and books just aren't analogies or metaphors. So one of them said, for instance, a metaphor is telling a player in their defensive stance to get low or to stand on the balls of their feet. That's just not an analogy or metaphor. Get low is a poor instruction because it's unspecific, and get on the ball of your feet is pretty much just an explicit instruction. So some of the analogies and metaphors that I've used, is when you're talking about teaching a player how to shoot a layup, you might say to take off like a rocket ship, not an airplane. Okay, so again, an analogy is simply just a comparison between two things. A metaphor is kind of about the same thing, where you're trying to compare two unrelated things it's used primarily in literature, but so for a literary effect. And then a simile is a metaphor where you use as or like. And so if I'm comparing a person to a plane, or a person to a rocket ship, but I'm trying to get that effect of I want them to jump straight up instead of jumping out. But instead of explaining it in more explicit terms, I'm using the imagery or the analogy between a person and a rocket ship. Another instruction that I'll use is shoot out of a telephone booth. So rather than telling a player, I want you to, extend your elbow higher or something like that, just shoot out of a telephone booth. It creates an image, and is a use of an analogy or a metaphor to create that image in the player's mind. These tools, whether you want to think of it as imagery or whether you want to think of them as analogies or metaphors, these tools are effective because they're more external instructions or external cueing for players. And research by people like Rich Masters and Gabriel Wolf have shown over the last few years, and in the case of Masters for the last 25 years, that external cues will tend to break down less frequently in pressure situations than an internal cue. So when you teach a player to shoot and you get them focusing on their elbow or their knees or their foot or some part of their body, some internal part of their shot or their technique, where you're focusing on their body, that will lead to more paralysis by analysis later in performance situations when there's the potential for anxiety or fatigue or something like that, as opposed to when you use a more external cue. So again, I could tell a player, I want you to shoot higher, you need to raise your elbow, finish with your elbow higher, something like this, where I'm getting them to focus on their body. But instead, I'm just going to create an image, or I'm going to use the analogy of shooting out of a telephone booth. And so, again, the research has shown that will have, especially for non-beginners, that will have a more positive effect, lead to better learning, and ultimately lead to better performance.